History is usually described as exciting, full of heroes, inventions, and discoveries. But if we look closer, there are chapters so ordinary, so uneventful, that even the writers who recorded them almost fell asleep while writing. Welcome to the forgotten yawns of history, the side of the past that reminds us not every day was a big event. Sometimes history was just quiet. Our story begins in a small medieval town. Picture a quiet morning, a monk sitting at a wooden desk, a candle glowing beside him. His job was to record what happened each day. Some days he wrote about markets, weather, or small disputes. But one day he dipped his quill into ink and wrote a single line. Today, nothing of importance occurred. That was it. 7 words, no festivals, no surprises, no unusual news, just calm, what nothing really means. At first glance, this line feels empty, but think about it. In a world where daily life was often unpredictable, a quiet day was precious. It meant families could rest, farmers could work their fields, and no unexpected troubles arrived. For that monk, writing nothing happened was not laziness. It was honesty. He was saying life was peaceful today. If he lived in modern times, maybe he'd post on social media day no drama, just bread and sunshine. Cloudy weather, normal day. Sometimes the calmest days are the ones people treasure the most. The monks and their routine. Monks were careful record keepers. They lived simple lives of prayer, study, and writing. Imagine their routine. Wake up before sunrise, sing hymns, eat plain meals, copy texts, sleep, repeat, day after day. So when one monk wrote nothing happened, he wasn't bored, he was accurate. His world was steady and predictable, and for historians today, that small line has become a rare window into how ordinary people valued peace over drama. A farmer's endless notes. Centuries later, across the ocean, a farmer in New England kept a daily diary. His entries were wonderfully plain. The weather clear, worked in the field. Weather cloudy, still worked in the field. Weather damp, field work continued. For 30 days straight, this was all he wrote. No excitement, no gossip, just farming. To him, farming was life. To us, it might sound repetitive, but for researchers today, his simple notes are valuable. They show how people planted, harvested, and lived through the seasons. His boring pages became important records. Venice and the grocery lists. Meanwhile, in Venice, record keepers were famous for writing down every shipment that entered the city. They listed spices, silks, metals, but also cheese, onions, and fish. Page after page, their scrolls read like giant grocery receipts. Other cities sometimes complained about how detailed these reports were. But for Venice, this precision was power. It showed their strength in trade and wealth. Today, historians laugh at how seriously Venetians wrote about cheese. But those boring lists helped Venice rule the seas, the global yawns. Boring history was not limited to Europe or America. In Japan, a noble once wrote in his notes, "Practice patience, nothing else." At the time, it was an ordinary day. But that noble later became one of the most important leaders in the country. His boring days shaped the discipline he would later need. Sometimes the quietest moments prepare people for the biggest changes. Hidden comedy, some boring records are unintentionally funny. In a small German town, officials once debated shoelace length for soldiers. For 3 entire days, they argued whether laces should be long or short. Finally, they announced shoelaces must not exceed 12 inches. The record still survives, and today it reads like history's first office meme. But for them, it was serious. Why it matters. So why do we care about cheese receipts, farming notes, or shoelace debates? Because they remind us that history is not just made of big events, it's also made of quiet days, small choices, and routines. If we only focus on famous battles and inventions, we miss the reality of how most people lived. Ordinary days carried the world forward just as much as extraordinary ones. The day nothing happened teaches us something important. Boring does not mean useless. Those quiet records show us peace, stability, and the rhythm of daily life. They remind us that history is not only about kings and leaders, it's about everyone, living one ordinary day at a time. And maybe, just maybe, those yawns are what held civilization together. The quiet streets of old towns were not only filled with the sounds of horses and bells. Behind closed wooden doors, people often gathered in large halls to talk about matters that at first glance seemed too ordinary to even mention. These gatherings were written down carefully in books, and those notes still survive today. One such meeting took place in a small German town during the early 1400s. Leaders came together to make rules for the appearance of soldiers. Instead of discussing armor or training, the focus moved towards shoelaces. Page after page of the record shows how seriously they debated whether laces should be long or short. In the end, they created a rule: shoelaces should not go beyond a certain length. Imagine the amount of time spent on something so tiny. Far away in Venice, clerks filled books with lists of goods arriving at the port. Not just spices or silk, but also onions, cheese, and jars of oil. Line after line looked more like a grocery receipt than a record of a great city. To modern eyes, it feels dull, but those lists showed Venice's wealth and everyday life more clearly than any grand speech. Across the ocean in early New England, town councils also had their share of slow decision-making. One case involved a wooden bridge that connected farms to the marketplace. People asked for repairs, and the council agreed to review it next month. The same line appeared again and again in the records, as the meeting notes stretched across many months. By the time action was finally taken, the bridge was no longer in use. Even in royal courts, details could stretch into endless talk. In France, officials around the king held long discussions about forks. Which fork should be placed with which dish? How far from the plate should it rest? Pages of notes were made, turning a dinner table into a rule book. To us, it may sound amusing, but to them, these small matters reflected respect, order, and social rank. Sometimes the records show silence more than action. In one English monastery, a monk left several pages of his diary completely blank. At first, historians wondered if the book was damaged. Later, they realized it was intentional. Perhaps those days were so calm that he felt there was nothing to say. In its own way, those empty pages speak just as loudly as words. What all of these examples have in common is a strange mixture of patience and detail. Leaders, clerks, and monks filled their days with notes about shoelaces, onions, bridges, forks, and even silence. Each page may look boring, but together they form a picture of how people really live. Their priorities may seem small, yet they matter deeply in their time, and that is the secret. History is not only built from grand events, it is also shaped by the countless hours spent in meetings, lists, and notes about ordinary things. What feels like nothing important to us today was, in fact, the fabric of daily life for them. After pages filled with meetings, shoelaces, and forks, history also left us with records that sound even more ordinary. Instead of great events, many writers preferred to note the simple rhythm of daily life. What looks like plain scribbles to us today was once seen as careful observation. One English farmer, living in the 1600s, kept a diary that was almost entirely about the weather. Every morning, he opened his book and wrote one or two short lines, cloudy in the morning or a gentle breeze in the evening. He continued this habit for decades. At the time, it may have seemed unremarkable, but now researchers treat his diary as a valuable record of climate patterns. The most boring sentences turned into priceless information. In France, a noblewoman also kept detailed notes, though not about politics or art. Her pages listed laundry days. She wrote down how many gowns were washed, how many tablecloths were scrubbed, and which collars were rinsed. For her, it was household management. For us, it shows the endless work hidden behind fancy clothing and grand dinners. Elsewhere in Europe, officials were obsessed with bread prices. Scroll after scroll carefully tracked how many loaves could be bought with a single coin. It reads like a never-ending math problem, yet these notes quietly reveal the heartbeat of communities. Bread was more than food, it was stability. When bread was affordable, families could relax. When it grew expensive, people worried. In a monastery, monks sometimes recorded the number of candles left in storage. They counted each one as if it were gold. Without candles, evenings became dark and silent. These records remind us that comfort often depended on the simplest objects. What seems unimportant now was once at the center of daily planning. Across the ocean, families in early America kept household books where they listed purchases: flour, molasses, cloth, buttons. One father wrote such lists for over 30 years. His notebook eventually became a family heirloom, passed down through generations. What began as routine shopping notes transformed into a portrait of family life. Even in Japan, one scholar filled pages with almost nothing. His diary often contains single words: quiet, calm, or the usual. At first glance, it looks empty, but perhaps that was his point. Most days in life are not filled with drama, they are simply ordinary. His diary captured that truth in the simplest way possible. When we look at these weather logs, laundry notes, bread prices, candle counts, and shopping lists, a pattern emerges. History is not just shaped by leaders and events, but also by routine. The boring pages remind us that people everywhere cared about daily survival, comfort, and order. These were the invisible threads that held life together. And strangely, there is a kind of humor in it. Imagine someone centuries from now reading your grocery receipt or your phone reminders. To them, it might look funny or dull, but it would still tell a story about your world. Just as we smile at old shoelace rules and candle counts, future generations might smile at how carefully we tracked coffee, chargers, or streaming subscriptions. So the plain pages of history are not really empty. They are filled with the sound of normal life, the part that rarely makes headlines, that always defines human experience. If there is one thing history loved to collect, it was numbers. Page after page, old records look like endless tables with rows of figures that seem to have no end. At first sight, they appear meaningless, but together they show how entire societies functioned. One example comes from medieval tax rolls. Clerks wrote down every penny owed by villagers. The scrolls stretched so long that readers today sometimes laugh, wondering who had the patience to copy so many numbers. Yet, these records reveal how communities balanced their duties. Behind each figure was a household, a family, and a story of survival. In Italy, city officials documented the cost of salt. Every cartload, every handful was measured and written. Salt may seem ordinary to us, but in those days it was valuable. It preserved food and kept meals safe, though a boring list of salt shipments actually tells us about health, trade, and the rhythm of meals. China's imperial records took lists to another level. For centuries, scribes carefully counted rice harvests, bushels stacked in storehouses, and grains collected as tax. To them, rice was life. A single page could show the rise or fall of a village. Modern historians now treat these lists as evidence of population growth, weather shifts, and economic change. Even monasteries were not free from number obsession. Monks often noted how many sheep they owned, how much wool was collected, and how much ale was brewed. Reading these inventories feels like reading receipts from a farm shop, yet they provide a unique picture of how communities supported themselves. In some American towns, officials tracked the number of fences built each year. Entire books listed wooden posts and nails used. Though strange to us, fences marked property and safety. Those lists spoke of order, boundaries, and the effort to create stability in a growing world. When all these numbers are seen together, they may look dull, but they carry hidden meaning. They show what people valued, feared, and depended on. Each figure is like a footprint left by daily life, and perhaps there is a quiet comedy in it too. Imagine a monk proudly noting, 6 candles left. Or a farmer writing with care, 3 buckets of oats. They never guessed that centuries later, people would study those lines and smile at their seriousness. The lesson is clear. History is not only about kings or battles, it is also about the numbers scribbled in ledgers, the endless list that seemed unimportant but held entire societies together. As we move past the numbers, the lists, the receipts, and the weather notes, one question remains: why did people write so many ordinary things down? The answer lies in the human need to remember, even the smallest details. In old villages, scribes were often asked to copy marriage contracts. These contracts rarely contained romance. Instead, they listed cows, blankets, or a field of grain as part of the agreement. Boring to read, yet they preserved the structure of family life. A single cow on paper might have been more valuable than a dozen poems. In towns across Europe, shopkeepers recorded every sale in small notebooks. They wrote about nails, ropes, candles, and buckets. Centuries later, archaeologists used these shop books to rebuild the image of markets and streets. Each item sold shows what people needed to get through their day. Even ships carried logbooks filled with repetitive notes. Wind from the west, clouds in the east, water supplies low. Sailors often wrote the same words again and again. To them, it was duty. To us, it shows the patience required to cross oceans. The logbooks may seem dull, but they reveal courage hidden behind routine. In libraries, monks cataloged books, often copying the same titles again and again. These catalogs look like lists of names, but without them, many texts might have been lost forever. Their boring work became the bridge that carried knowledge across centuries. What makes all of this fascinating is that boring history often survives longer than exciting history. Dramatic events might be sung in songs for a while, but they fade. A shopping list, however, stays preserved in a drawer. A tax roll gets sealed in an archive. A diary filled with weather notes is passed down by families. In the end, the small things outlast the big.